Stanford University.
Hey everybody, my name is Stephen Feaster, and I'm a developer relations engineer at Palm. And what I do is provide support in terms of resources such as sample code and documentation, as well as direct technical support to third-party developers that are creating apps for our platform. And I'm going to be giving an introduction to developing on WebOS today. So I'm going to go over the WebOS architecture very briefly, and applications architecture, as well as building a really simple application on WebOS. So WebOS, currently we have two hardware platforms, the Pre and Pixie. There's also the Pre and Pixie Plus. Those are basically similar, just slight variations on these two devices. And so basically, these are the two different devices. That's just this guy turned. They both have a physical keyboard. It's the Pre is hidden. It's a slider. And let's see. They're pretty up-to-date current device specs. 8 gigs of RAM. I won't go into the details. So WebOS, it's we like to say it's built from the DNA of the web, or somebody likes to say it at least. Basically, we say that because for a developer, it means that you can develop your application in a very similar way as you would develop a web application. You use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We do provide another SDK, or we call it the PDK, for native development using C and C++, and it lets you get closer to the metal of the device. But for majority of applications, or kind of non-game, super high performance applications, we have a Mojo SDK, which allows you to build an application using web technologies. So the WebOS architecture, at the core, it's a Linux operating system, basically a full Linux mobile operating system. And when you use the PDK, you actually have some interaction with it. But from the Mojo web type developer application, SDK applications, we actually have a layer above that you interact with. And it's the system manager provides a runtime environment for our Mojo web applications, which run inside an instance of WebKit, which is the same engine that's powering like Safari and Chrome and such. And it also hosts our Mojo framework, which provides a UI and windowing type framework for applications. So with a Mojo application, everything, it's similar to a web application, but everything is local rather than basically like creating a client-side web application. I mean, you can still interact with servers and all that, but see it in a similar way as a local client application. But more than just a browser client application, you actually can tie into the device pretty well. So it's similar to a native. Basically, it's a native application just running inside of a WebKit instance. And there's some key aspects to Mojo applications. I'll cover these more, but stages, scenes, widgets, and services. So a stage is basically, you can think of it as a window. We also call them cards because, well, here you can see it in card view, where I didn't say this actually. Another aspect to WebOS is it's a multitasking operating system. So you can have multiple applications running, and you can put this is like this actually here. This card off to the side this is it in full screen view, and then you can we call it carding the window, and you can scroll through your various windows. And then inside of the stages, sorry, I'm getting it. A stage is the same as a window, which is the same as a card. We have scenes, which are views inside of the stage, and scenes are basically stacked on top of each other. So here you might hit in the email application, you might hit your inbox link, and then you'd come to your inbox, and so this would be a scene stacked on top of this scene, and we call it pushing a scene. And then if you wanted to go back to this scene, you could use, you go back, which would be calling popping the scene. So it's basically stack fashion with the scenes. And you go back here. And we have, I also didn't say, we have some, we call them gestures on the device. So to go back or to card something if you're at the first scene in a stage, you can use, slide your finger back. And it basically, it's like a back button. And then we also have the gesture where you can slide your finger up, and it brings up the application launcher. Sorry if you guys can't see it very well. But it provides a really nice user interface, and it's actually using this area of the device below the screen. So scenes are where the majority, well, stages are like the window, are like a window, and then inside of the stages we have scenes, which is where most of the action happens. And we have the scene, there's a scene lifecycle. So basically, when you push a scene onto a stage, a scene has an associated JavaScript assistant file, which is just a JavaScript object, basically, that has, well, I won't get into that part, but it's a JavaScript object that is initialized, and then it goes through these various scene life cycles. So it goes through a setup function, which you declare in your JavaScript assistant. And during setup, you can do things like set up UI widgets and such, or any other type of setup you have for your application, or sorry, for your scene. And then there's a couple of stages that are actually kind of invisible to a developer. They're more for our internal framework that helps you create an application to do. But then there's Activate, which you get your Activate function will get called just before the scene becomes live. And then a deactivate function, which happens when you push another scene on top of the current scene, or if you pop a scene and you go back to a previous scene, that deactivate function will be called as well. And a cleanup function, which gets called just before the scene is fully popped off the stack. So a scene has two elements. It has an HTML view file and a JavaScript assistant file. And we use the MVC pattern, the model view controller pattern, with models used kind of lightly, or optional, I guess you could say. The view would be your HTML file for your scene. And this is an example of a poorly formatted view file. Basically, this is setting up two buttons. They're not actually using UI widgets here. It's using standard divs. And so just giving it an ID of my activate button, my destroy button, and then a class of palm button. And the class palm button and this class negative, those are palm-defined CSS classes. We provided a bunch of CSS classes and images for you to use in applications. And so what this would look like would just be these two buttons. So then this would be an example of maybe an assistant file that would be associated with that scene. And what this is the setup function I was talking about. This will be called just before your scene becomes live. So here we're setting up a handler for the button, only for the destroy button. And this is kind of, things are a little verbose in our platform right now, but basically what this is doing is, well, we have a handler function right here. It's just going to print a log to the console or to a terminal window, this message right here, as well as the event, which I don't know what it'll print out for that, just putting an event there. But here we're binding this function to this property. And the reason we don't, well, sorry, and then I'll finish this. And then here we're actually listening to tap events from that button, and then calling our handler, which is this function. And the reason we do it this way rather than just putting this bind right in here is because during cleanup, we want to stop listening to tap events and basically unregister that handler. So we have to keep a reference to it here. It's getting a little more complicated than maybe we need to, but you can have a slight memory leak if you don't clean up your handlers, basically. It's something we'd like to not make developers worry about in the future, but for now it's the case. And that was just what I was referring to, cleaning up your handler references. So building your first app. Yeah, I guess I can get right into creating an application. So actually, I should go into installing the SDK, I think, first. It's pretty straightforward. You'll just go to developer.palm.com. So developer.palm.com. And then go to this Getting Started link. I'm using the internet connection through my phone right now. It's kind of slow. Might not even work. Well, basically, you go to the Getting Started link, and then there's a download link for, depends on your platform you're on, but it's pretty straightforward. I don't think you guys will have any trouble with this. So once you download it, once you download the SDK, that'll provide you with a tool to generate applications, a tool to generate scenes in an application, a debugger, as well as sample code and reference code you can actually look through our Mojo framework, which provides a framework to create applications with. You can look through the source code of that. And we also provide the source code to a number of our built-in applications like email, and I'm not sure what all we provide. Email at least, and calendar, and maybe even the browser. So we actually there's quite a bit there you can look through. Oh, here you go. So this is Getting Started. And then here's a download SDK. That'll probably take 5 more minutes. So once you download the SDK, you'll get what I just explained. Oh, and an emulator as well, which I have running here. And the emulator is based on VirtualBox. And actually, you can see it provides a nice environment. So here's the application launcher. Here's an example of email. And there's a card view. And when you're done using an application, you can toss, it's kind of hard on the simulator, you can toss your card away. So you can also, depending on what your preference is for coding in, you can, kind of our default supported environment is Eclipse. So you can just download a standard install of Eclipse. And we provide plugins for Eclipse, so it lets you create, generate applications from Eclipse. Yeah, that's all described on the site. And then, or you can, if you prefer, you can create applications from the terminal window or console, depending what platform you're on. So here actually is a Palm Generate script we provide. And you can tell if you had a successful install of the SDK, depending on, so I just type Palm Generate and it gives you a help file of how to use Palm Generate. But I'm going to create an application from Eclipse. And so to do that, open Eclipse, go to New, New Project. And then you should have this Palm WebOS type. And I'm just going to create a basic application. Give it a name. And this lets you populate some metadata for your application, like your company name, vendor, version type, or version number. So it creates this app right here. And you can see it creates a app folder, images folder, style sheets folder, and several other files. I'll just briefly go over those. So here it opened up appinfo.json. And what this is a JSON file that provides some metadata about your application, such as an ID, which that ID has to be unique on the system. And typically it's a company name and an app name, version number, and well, basically standard stuff you can probably expect. Main, which is the first HTML page that opens for the app. And right now it's index.html by default. And the title that you want to appear on your app. So up in the little bar, up, well, here we go, there. So that title. And the icon that you want for your app, which will appear in the launcher. So that's appinfo.json. And there's a few other properties that you can add to it depending on your app. They're documented. There's a framework config.json, which basically provides different settings for your application, like if debugging is turned on, what the log level is for your application, and several other things that are documented. Here's the icon for your application. Sources.json. This file actually specifies the source location of your JavaScript assistants. I won't get into more detail. There's some more info on that, but that's the basic idea. You can see more on the site about that if you want to learn more about this file. And then index.html. This is similar to a standard web application loads index.html first. WebOS application loads this file. And even though there's no body tags that were populated here, but actually all the content in a stage is actually inserted in between the body tags in index.html, which you'll see in a minute maybe. And sorry, in this file actually we basically here we're loading a version of the Mojo framework. So they're providing a path to the Mojo framework. And then we specify which version of the framework we want. So in the future we could have multiple versions of the framework in the wild. And if your application maybe your application isn't compliant with the newest framework, so you can specify an older framework if you need to use it. And then you load any style sheets here for application styling. And then we also have, and here's this default style sheet created. There's nothing actually in it when you create an app. So then we have the app directory. This is where most of the action happens. We have an assistants folder and a views folder, and some people create a models folder here to kind of to complete the MVC pattern, where an assistant is basically the controller in the MVC pattern. So by default, we have something created called a StageAssistant, and this is one of the first JavaScript files that's loaded when you create an application. There is an exception to that, but it's more advanced. I won't get into that today. So the first function that's going to be called by the framework when an application loads is this StageAssistant setup function. And in here, usually what you'll do is you'll push a scene. And this StageAssistant is basically the controller file for a card. So any high-level stage-specific functionality you'll put into this controller usually, and all the scenes that are part of that card have access to this object. So I'm going to create, since now it doesn't really do much, I'll launch this application, and I'm not sure if it will. Let's see if it'll launch this way. Okay, yeah. So you can see the title of this app, and it's just a blank card right now. So put something in it. I'm going to create a new scene. I'll just label this first. And we just generated a first assistant and first scene view. So the first assistant, it stubs out the lifecycle, scene lifecycle functions: cleanup, deactivate, activate, setup, and the JavaScript constructor function. And the view file just adds in a little bit of HTML. So now if we launch the app now, nothing will happen. We have to first add in our stage assistant, we have to push the scene. So we say this .controller push scene first. So basically we're using the controller of this stage assistant to push a scene on the card, and the first scene is this first one that we just created. So now if I run it, we get that HTML that was in the first view file there. that stuff. So now I'm going to create, I'm not going to use any UI widgets in this demo. This is just to get a feel for the architecture of an app in WebOS. So I'm just going to create a standard div. I'm going to call it button. And if I do this, let's see what we get. Oops. So it doesn't look like a button yet, just a standard div with text. So if I add this Palm defined CSS class, Palm button, then we will get a div that should look like a button there. So it's actually getting tap events when I hit it, but you don't, you're not seeing anything because it's just a div. So a button widget a button widget will provide what looks like a fully functioning button, but we're not going to use widgets today. So then in here, in the assistant, I'm going to have it do something. So I'm going to declare a button handler function. And I want to do one more thing here. I'm going to create a div where I can put a little message and use kind of sloppy coding techniques. But yeah, so I've got a button handler. And then I'm going to create I'm going to get a reference to the button. Since our button div our button ID is just button, and this .controller.listen, that's actually it's a Mojo provided framework function, and this will go out and grab the the button element, just by doing that. You don't have to use any fancy or any special JavaScript functions. And then we're going to be listening for the Mojo tap event, so I'm going to use that. And then we're going to call. So this is actually bad practice I'm going to do right here, but for simplicity, I am basically I'm binding the button handler I just created directly in this listener. We actually don't want to do it. Well, maybe I should do it. Maybe since I'm being recorded, I better do it properly. So this will keep a reference to that guy. Okay, so we're keeping a reference to it. And then, so this is going to be listening for our button tap. And then in our button tap handler, I'm using the, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the prototype library. It's not this prototype. This is actually a JavaScript, part of JavaScript. This is prototype library, and this just lets you easily grab elements. We have functions in Mojo to do it, but for time, I'm just using the prototype library. So I'm going to grab the div that I ID'd update area. And I'm going to say that the button was pressed. So let's see, it should hopefully work. Okay, there. That was kind of quick. You might not have seen it. I'll run it. It's not a very sophisticated application. But basically, we registered our tap handler. And when the button is pressed, this function is going to be called. The tap handler is going to be called, which updates a div that's hidden right now, or just doesn't have any text in it below the button. So when you hit it, that div is updated. And and then for good measure, we want to, like I was saying earlier, we want to stop listening on our tap handler to prevent any memory leaks. So in the cleanup function, which is going to be called when if this scene is popped off the stage, which it's not going to be because this is currently it's our first scene, so there's nothing below it that it could be popped off of. But basically, you just want to repeat, just like the listen function, but say stop listening. And we won't be listening for button taps anymore when the scene is cleaned up. And so that's the basic idea of or basic architecture of a really simple Mojo application. I don't think I'll go any further than that. There will be more in-depth demos in the future. But I will briefly, let's see, I think I'll move back to the presentation. OK, so this is actually the same as what we did in Eclipse. It's just this is generating a new application from the command line. And same thing, just a directory structure. Here's the appinfo.json. We covered that. The index.html, which is the first page of your loaded application, the first page that's loaded in your application. And all the HTML that we created for the first scene, that's actually, you don't see the body tags here, but I guess they're added by default, or the WebKit knows to add them. All the HTML in a card or a stage is actually inserted into the body tags. And so when you push a new scene, the old scene HTML is removed, and then the new scene's HTML is inserted into the body tags. So this is the same thing from a terminal to generate a scene. And then StageAssistant, which is the first object that's utilized by the framework when you launch a card, and it's an object that is used to control the logic of a card or a stage. And this is just an example of a view file for a scene. And then Eclipse did this for us, but when you run an application, you need to package it, which will package the application into an IPK. And then you need to install it onto the emulator or device. And Eclipse was doing this behind the scenes for us. We just had to hit run. But if you do it from the terminal, you'll do that. And then each scene has a stage assistant, which contains all of the controller logic for an assistant. So we also, just briefly, we also provide UI controls called widgets, which make things easy, like text fields, buttons, lists, toggle switches, I don't think we provide a toggle switch anymore, actually. A radio button, sliders, and such. And usually they're set up in your setup function in Assistant. And some of them require template HTML files. So lists, like each item will need a template HTML file, each item in the list, and you can really customize things that way. And well, some things models are optional for a widget, but usually, like say you have a list and you want to have a bunch of items, you'll probably set up a model that you'll be using with that list. And then we also provide, to gain access, to really make the applications more native, we provide access to hardware through what we call services. And we provide JavaScript APIs or interfaces, which let your application access all these types of things on the device, like the accelerometer, GPS, display, camera, audio, video, connection manager. Quite all the things you'd expect from a smartphone. And they're really easy. Services are really easy to use in general. We'll go into that in another lecture as well, actually. And then the emulator, like I said, it's based on VirtualBox. It's an x86 build of WebOS. It provides a nice environment, very similar device, but a few things aren't supported, like camera, multi-touch, audio and video currently. And this is on the site as well, but you can navigate the emulator with a few different hotkeys. And we also provide logging, which I didn't show you. If you want to see current logging going on with your application, you can add log messages in your application and log out to the terminal using this command. And then you can also simulate some events on the emulator by using this Luna send command. Luna is a reference to our system manager. It's kind of a internal name is Luna, but it's pretty public now. Basically, you send a command through your terminal to your emulator, And you can do things like fake an incoming call. So this will pop up the phone interface and make it look like someone's calling. So you can test things when you're developing your application to see what type of effect a call and different things like an SMS message coming in would have on your application. And well, that's it. It's kind of a weird place to stop. But that's the basic idea of a WebOS application. And I think we have a question session later, right at the end. OK. So Gray's up next, and he's going to cover our Aries IDE.
So has anybody taken a look at Aries already? No hands? OK, this will be interesting because Aries is sometimes mistakenly perceived as a completely different alternative to developing for WebOS. Some of the press that wrote about it picked up on it that way. What it really is it's just more like an alternative to the Eclipse IDE that Stephen was showing you. But it does introduce a really different way of working with Mojo. So after having seen Stephen's intro to Mojo, then once you see Aries, I think you will be surprised at how different it may look. So, if as you're working on your apps for WebOS, you can actually move back and forth between using things like Eclipse and the command line tools, along with the editor of your choice and Aries. I think more likely you'll end up choosing one or the other. So you'll either decide to use Aries or not. And even if you do use Aries, you're still going to have to understand a bunch of the Mojo concepts, because while Aries simplifies a lot of things for you, it's still Mojo underneath, and there are certain things. Aries is pretty much brand new. We just released the what we're calling the 1.0 version this week, actually. And it's really good at a lot of stuff, but there are certain areas where, as you're going into development, Aries doesn't provide direct support for a bunch of the features of WebOS. And that doesn't mean you can't utilize those features if you develop in Aries. It just means to invoke those features from within Aries, you're going to have to kind of pop down to the Mojo layer. OK, let me just check and see. OK, so I've deliberately, the thing about Aries that makes it unique as far as IDEs go, especially IDEs for mobile, is that it runs entirely in a browser. So you can run it in Firefox, you can run it in Safari, you can run it in Chrome with some limitations. It uses Java to communicate with either a physical WebOS device or the WebOS emulator. So it works best right now in Safari or Firefox. I'm running it in Firefox right now. So I wanted to back all the way out to the sign-in page just to give you the full experience that you'll get when you go to Aries. So I've just typed in my username and password. This is just an account you create at developer.palm.com. I'll say sign in. And I created a brand new account for myself. So this is exactly what it'll look like when you create a new account and sign into Aries. I'll give you a quick tour of the interface. You'll see a sample app has actually been created for you. And you can work directly out of that, or you can create a new app, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to choose New Application. App 1 is a fine name for it. And when I create the application, let's actually quickly take a look at the file structure. Because if you were paying attention to what Stephen was talking about, you'll see that this is exactly the same file structure as in a typical Mojo app. So we have our appinfo.json file, which I won't open. We have our assistants folder, our views folder. It's pretty much the same stuff. There's just an extra layer on top of it. And really what Aries provides is an integrated development environment. And it also has its own layout model. So it has a graphical interface for laying out scenes, which greatly speeds things up. And it also has its own way of handling events. And so you saw the multiple steps that were required to listen to an event and then bind a handler to it in Mojo, and Aries greatly simplifies that. So here on the left side of our screen, we have a palette of user interface widgets. we have a hierarchical view of the scene that I'm editing right now, which right now is empty, so there's not much to look at. And then we have this file view, which I was showing you. The interesting thing to note here is that Aries lets you manage multiple applications, and these are all actually sitting on a Palm server, so that you can be editing on one computer, close your browser session, go somewhere else, pop open another browser, and all of your files are there. You can very easily download an application locally. You can even download it and delete it if you're uncomfortable with having your stuff sit on the server, but we're not looking at it. We're not going to do anything bad with it, so I don't think you have anything to worry about. So in any case, this is a single file system view of all the applications in your Aries workspace. In the middle, we have the area where we're going to spend most of our time in this demo, actually laying out the scene. And on the right, we have sort of a properties palette, which has several different tabs. And we'll take a look at all of these different tabs as we go ahead. So let's go ahead and get started doing some simple layouts. I'm going to drag widget out. This one I've chosen right now is the standard look for a WebOS header, and I'm going to call it map. This is a new component which we just added in Aries 1.0, which is a very thin wrapper around the Google Maps v3 API. So I dragged out a map onto my scene as well. And you can see we have a bunch of other widgets here. There are widgets for picking dates and times. There are slider widgets. I'm going to go ahead and just drop a button down there. And you can see that all the things I've dragged out are, by default, stacking vertically. There's a bunch of other ways to lay things out in Aries as well, which I'll show you. But for now, I'm going to give my button some text. And as you can see, you actually get a very faithful representation here of what it might look like on device. But Aries also offers a couple of ways of previewing what you're working on. So I'm going to go ahead and save what I've done. And then this button up here is what I use to test my app. And I can do that in a couple different ways. The simplest way, if you're just working on layout, is to actually look at it in the browser itself. So I've chosen that, and you can see that this is basically, it's a little bit like our emulator, but it's running entirely in the browser. And this is something we can do because our native development environment is all HTML, JavaScript, and CSS based. And the button doesn't do anything, but you can see that it highlights properly when tapped, and the Google Maps control is fully functional, so I can pan and browse it and do all of that good stuff. So I'll go ahead and close that browser preview, and I'm going to show you the same thing now previewed in the emulator. So I have the emulator running here. I'm going to come back to my browser, click the preview button, and it will launch that app. OK, so let's actually get rid of some of these elements and do a little bit more complicated layout. So I mentioned that Aries makes it possible to not only vertically stack things, but offers a wide array of ways to arrange things on the screen. And let's actually mock up a simple sign-in screen that you might use if your application involved signing into a backend service of some kind. So I've changed my header to sign in, and I'm going to scroll down and look at some of the other things on my palette here. And among the things that are here is a WebOS style group. And I'm going to use a group to provide sort of a label for what we're doing here. So I'll call this username. And then I'm going to drag a second group out. And we'll call that one password. And those are just groups, so there aren't actually any text fields. So now I'm going to come back up and drop a password field. And notice as I drag this out, I can drag it. I'm getting cues from Aries as to where I'm going to drop it. So right now I'd be dropping it below that password group. But if I hold it over password, you can see that the green underline appears there within the password group, which means that the password field I just put in is actually there inside the group. And so this concept of hierarchy in the Aries scene layout is something that is very important as you work on more complex things. So I'm going to move over to the View pane, and you can see this is a hierarchical representation of my scene. This is the root of the scene, and then I have my header, and I can select things here, and you can see them in the visual layout area as well. And you can see the hierarchy that's happening within this scene. So I put a password field there. I'm going to put a regular text field here. I'll save it again, and then we'll open our emulator. And you can see there's some default hint text, which I'll remove since we're already providing a hint with a label here as to what's supposed to go there. So I'll pop back into Aries. And over here on the left, we haven't done anything over here yet except change a label or two, but there's, depending on what you have selected, there are a bunch of specific properties, including, in this case, hint text. And I'm just going to delete that. And I'll do the same thing for the hint text and the password field. We'll preview our app again. By the way, to use the emulator along with Aries, you have to have installed the SDK. So the SDK gets installed on your local machine, including the emulator. And then Aries actually uses a Java applet within the browser app to communicate with the emulator on your desktop. So each time I preview, actually, what's going on is the app that's sitting on the server at Palm gets packaged up, downloaded into the browser, and pushed over into the emulator. And all that happens in a matter of a second or two. OK, so here I have my name and password field. So I can enter those. And you can see that the password field behaves as you would expect it to. And so none of this is actually hooked up to any functionality in the back. But you can see we have a very functional user interface taking shape. So let's actually provide a button, a way to sign in. We'll call it sign in. And that looks pretty good. But suppose we wanted to, for the sake of visual design, move that sign in button down to the bottom of the screen. As we've seen, Aries by default just stacks things vertically. And if I select the container here, you can see over on the side, this element, the container element, has a layout kind of VBox, which stands for vertical box. And there's a number of other choices as well, including absolute. So I'm going to switch that container to an absolute layout. And nothing happened visually right away. But if I take that sign-in button, I can now drag it down to the bottom of my scene. If that's the effect you're going for, it's very easy to do by switching to an absolute layout. Now, layout is a tricky thing, though. And so one of the issues here is that this layout, while it works great on the simulated pre-screen, might not work on a Pixie. And Aries, fortunately, makes it easy to test both horizontal and vertical layouts, as well as the different devices we support. And as you can see, the sign-in button is now off the bottom of the screen. So let's pop up to the pre-layout again. And with that button still selected, I'm going to move over here to this resize behavior widget. And these red lines here are called struts. They basically show where this element is anchored in the scene. And so by unanchoring it from the top and instead anchoring it to the bottom, I can now switch to my Pixie layout or even any of these horizontal layouts for Pixie and Pre, and you can see that the element remains anchored to the bottom as we want. So we've seen a vertically stacking layout. We've seen an absolute layout. But when you start getting more complex, there are actually lots of cases where you want to combine the different types of layouts. So let's go ahead and suppose we want to provide another button for people who don't have an account with our service yet, and perhaps a third button for them to get more info if they're not sure they want to create an account. And I want to have those buttons appear side by side below this sign-in button. But I want all of them to be anchored to the bottom of the screen still. So I'm going to move down here, and I can add another layout box as a child of the main layout for the scene. And so I'm going to take another vertical box. I'm going to drag it out onto the scene. And you can see because because we're in an absolute layout, it's sort of going off the side of the screen. Aries provides these handy buttons here for quickly sizing things to the surrounding space. So I hit the Maximize X button, which basically took that vertical panel and made it take up the full horizontal space on the screen. Now, I'm going to take this Sign In button and drag it out of the main layout into my new box. And then I want two buttons beneath that. So we also, in addition to the vertically stacking layout, we have a horizontal box layout. I'm going to take that and drag it in right below the Sign In button. And then I'll drag a button there, and we'll say Sign Up. And while we're here, we'll also change the class of this button to secondary so that it's de-emphasized. And then I'm going to grab another button and just drag it also in that same horizontal layout box. And this is where Aries starts working all kinds of crazy magic. So I dragged a second button in, and you can see that the horizontal box layout automatically spaced them evenly. And if you want to adjust the spacing, you can always do that manually. But in this case, it's pretty much what I want. So I'm going to say more info. We'll make this secondary as well. And then I actually want this guy to be on the other side. Now, as a final step, we still want this entire stack here to be anchored to the bottom of the screen. And so I'm going to switch the anchoring to the bottom, drag it down, and we now have a pretty complex layout that's combining absolute positioning, vertical positioning, and horizontal positioning. And Aries makes it really easy to do this kind of layout and even things that are considerably more complex. So let's take one last look at this in the emulator. And here we have our scene again with all of our fields and the full layout. So Stephen, how long do you think it would take to do something like this in pure Mojo?
Maybe somewhere between 20 minutes, 25 minutes maybe, yeah.
Yeah, so I think especially as you're getting started, it's going to be much faster and more efficient to do things with Aries and easier to experiment as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to Aries. I'm going to close that, and I'm going to move on from layout now to actually showing you some coding and debugging within Aries, because in addition to having a great layout engine, it's also probably the best, most integrated environment to develop in for doing things like coding and debugging as well. So I'm going to create yet another new app. And I'm going to call this wallpaper without the E, because what we're going to do is we're going to quickly wire up an app that grabs the most interesting pictures from Flickr and lets you set your wallpaper on the device. So again, we're back in the blank slate here. And again, we're going to start with dragging a widget out. And in this case, WebOS provides a very nice image view widget, which lets you swipe back and forth between images and pinch and zoom to magnify them and things. So I'm going to drag this out. And the image view right now doesn't really look like anything because there's no images in it. So very quickly, we're going to start populating that with some data. But before we do that, let's just take a look. I think all of my parameters here are actually good for now. If I wanted to, Aries would let me manually specify a set of images to use for it, but I'm not going to do that because we want to populate it dynamically. So in order to get the data in there, we need to make an AJAX request. And of course, you can make an AJAX request using the same methods that you would use on a website. But Aries actually provides a handy little widget for that as well, which simplifies a bunch of things. So all the components that we've used thus far have been visual components. I'm going to take this component, which is a non-visual component, and drag it out. And you'll see that it appears not in the scene, but here on the bottom of the screen. But just like the visual components, there are all kinds of parameters that I can set. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this component Flickr. And I'm going to go ahead and tell it what URL this lives at and see if I remember it. I think it's yahooapis.com v1 public. And I'm going to use something called YQL, which is, I think it's Yahoo query language. In any case, it's basically, it's a SQL-like front end that sits in front of all kinds of web services, both from Yahoo and from third parties. And so that's the base URL for YQL. And we want the response to come back as JSON. And now I'm going to set a couple of parameters. And I happen to know that what I want is a parameter called Q, which is short for query. And I'm going to select all from flickr.photos.interestingness. And I want to grab 10 of them. And then the other parameter that I need to set here, because YQL returns XML by default, is format is JSON. So I'll say OK. So those are the basic parameters for my request. But I still need to actually fire that request off and do something with the results. So if I come over here to the Events tab, you can see we're going to be very optimistic, and we're not going to code for failure. You should always, of course, have handlers for failures as well. But I'm just going to click on this button right here. If I wanted to type my own custom name for a success handler, I could type it here. But if I click this button on the side, it's going to give me a default name. And it's actually going to jump into a view which we haven't yet seen before, which is the code for the assistant that's sitting behind that scene. And in fact, I can toggle between the scene and the assistant very easily. So what I'm going to do first, just to make sure that our request is working properly, I'm just going to log this. So I'm going to say console.log, and I'll say Flickr success. So now we're going to go ahead and save everything. And below my code view here, I have the ability to bring up a log viewer. And you can see it's actually been logging all of the application launches I've done to this point. So I'm going to clear that out. And we're going to go ahead and run this in the emulator. And you can see in my log, I don't see anything about Flickr success. That's because I've left out one important step. So what we want, we still haven't fired off the AJAX request. So up here in my setup function, you can see that Aries is actually by default, it runs its own method to basically take all of the widgets that I've dragged onto screen and initiate them or initialize them. There's a way that I can refer to any Aries component, and it's this, in this case, this.$.flickr. And I'm just going to say execute. And that is going to go ahead and, if all goes well, run that AJAX request. I see. Every once in a while, you can get the emulator stuck, and I seem to have done it in a pretty bad way. Firefox is not happy at all. I'm going to restart my emulator because I have a feeling that there's something in the Java connection to the emulator that is what's hanging Firefox up. But maybe not. OK, so we're going to kill Firefox and open it right back up. OK, so as you can see, because I've been saving and testing, everything is right where I left it. Let's see whether we have any more luck with this than we were having before. OK, well, I've obviously done something wrong here. So what I'm going to do is go to plan B and log out of this account and go back to my main Aries account where I have a version of this that is working better, and we'll just walk through it there. Yeah, actually, what seems to be happening is that I'm never getting a response back from Flickr, which is really odd because these apps are definitely configured properly. So unfortunately, the demo is not going to turn out to be all I'd hope. But let's quickly walk through what we have here, and then I'll move on to letting you guys ask questions about this stuff. So we have the web service component that I had already gotten to putting in. We also have a download component, because once you select an image that you want to make your wallpaper, we re-download a copy of it, and then we have a wallpaper service, which basically connects to the device service for setting your wallpaper. And if we move to the code view, when the web service succeeds, it basically just walks through the results and populates the image view widget, so that the user can just swipe side to side to view the images. When the user sees one they like, they tap the Set Wallpaper button. And this is the button tap handler, which basically grabs the URL. And it actually, the nice thing about the image view is you can pinch and zoom to size it to exactly what you want. Since it's full screen, effectively what you're doing is you're allowing the user to crop crop the image so that it fits on their wall exactly the way they want it to. And so we're grabbing those scale parameters and storing them here. And then we're firing off a download using the download component. When the download succeeds, we grab the parameters. We call the import wallpaper command, passing it the pan and scale values, and effectively you're letting the user with a single button tap set their wallpaper to exactly the image that they selected and as they cropped it. And I really wish I could show you, because it looks a lot better than it sounds. But I'm going to stop there, and we'll certainly take any questions you have about either WebOS development in general, using Mojo, using Eclipse, using Aries. So. Anyone have any questions? So what are you thinking? Are you tempted by Aries? Are you a down to the metal, work in your text editor type of person, or? Yeah.
I think Aries would be really nice to set up the UI, and then if you needed to do more like coding stuff, you could always just export it.
Yeah, you can export it, or the text editor, so you can absolutely do that. One other thing that, because the integrated debugging stuff within Aries is good, you may actually find that even if you're not necessarily using a lot of the widgets for services stuff, and you tend to code those more by hand, you may still find yourself liking Aries as an environment to develop in. And in fact, we haven't announced it or done it yet, but within the next week or two, we're going to be releasing a sort of a subset of Aries, which is just the log viewer and the debugger, which works with the emulator. So you can use Eclipse or the command line tools, develop there, send it to the emulator, And then with the emulator open, you go to this web page and you can just use the debugger and the log viewer. So we sort of want to give you your choice of whatever configuration of tools works best for you. But I think a lot of the way that event handling and things are done, it's not just the layout of the UI, but the way that the UI elements are actually hooked up to functionality in the back end. Aries greatly simplifies that process for you and handles a lot of things automatically, including getting rid of all those event listeners, that Stephen mentioned. It does a lot of stuff under the hood, and so I would encourage you to sort of dig into Aries and maybe start there, because I think actually there's a bunch of stuff that's in Aries only right now that's ultimately going to make its way into the framework in general. So a lot of even if you're at the end of the day, you're not a web IDE GUI kind of guy, learning the Aries way of developing for WebOS is probably something that's going to be useful for you if you keep doing WebOS development going forward. So, anyone else have any questions or observations? All right, well, Connie, do you want to come up and handle administrative stuff?
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.